Carol Rofstad was 21 years old when she was found unconscious outside of her sorority house in Normal, Illinois on December 23, 1975. Carol had been severely beaten, and unfortunately, she would die of her injuries the next day on Christmas Eve. This December marks 45 years since Carol was murdered, and authorities are still trying to find out who killed Carol Rofstad. Hi guys, I'm Brooke and welcome back to Murder in the Midwest. If you're new to my channel, I talk about mainly unsolved homicides that have occurred in smaller rural communities in the Midwest. I am very excited to dive into today's case, which is about 21-year-old Carol Rofstad. It is one of the oldest unsolved homicides on Illinois State Police's website, and I believe her killer can still be found. Before we get into Carol's case, as always, if you like what you see, please hit that subscribe button below. There's also a bell notification you can hit and it will let you know when I upload new videos. I also have an Instagram that you can follow, which is also Murder in the Midwest, as well as a Twitter account, which is Murder Midwest. Guys, we're gonna dive right into Carol Rofstad's unsolved murder. It's really frustrating because I feel like if this had taken place today in 2020, her murder would have been arrested within a couple weeks with all the technology that we have available. But you have to think, back in 1975, there wasn't surveillance cameras. They didn't have Ring doorbells everywhere. Nobody had a cell phone. So just the technology that's available today that obviously would have been used wasn't available back then. So let's dive into exactly what happened to Carol. So Carol Rofstad was from Elk Grove Village, Illinois, which is up by Chicago. And she had been attending Illinois State University. She was actually a senior, and her murder took place during winter break. So if you've ever stayed behind on campus during winter break, as I did because I worked in retail, much like Carol did, so I feel an affinity for her, it is a little creepy. Or if you've ever just driven through a campus during winter break, it's very desolate. It almost feels like a ghost town. There's not a lot of people that are there. And I can remember many times coming home from working late because the stores are always open later at Christmas time, and feeling a little creepy when I would pull into the parking lot of my apartment complex and go inside, because I knew that there weren't many people around and I was probably only one of few people that was staying in my complex at the time. So I can only imagine how Carol must have felt. So like I said, she was 21 years old at the time of her death. She also had a brother, Robert, who was 18, and a sister, Laura. She was actually a member of the Delta Zeta sorority. And back in 1975, that sorority house was located at 602 South Fell Avenue, which is very centrally located to the ISU campus. She was working at a clothing store in downtown Normal called Hex Women's Apparel. I actually found a vintage ad that appeared in the newspaper. This newspaper ad was actually run December 3rd, 1975, so it was about 3 weeks before Carol was killed. But in the ad, there's a list of other stores in downtown Normal, and they're all saying, you know, staying open late, come on down, free parking. So it's theorized that she worked her shift at Hex Women's Apparel, and then she met up with a friend for a drink at a nearby bar. They were leaving, and the two women were walking together for part of that way home, and then they took their separate ways so that her friend could go home and that Carol could go to her sorority house. After Carol and her friend went their separate ways, we're not exactly sure what happened. We do know that Carol had two fellow sorority sisters that were staying in the house. They said that they heard and saw nothing unusual. So unfortunately, they weren't any help in the investigation. What we do know is the following day, which was December 23rd, Carol's unconscious body was found in the yard of the sorority house. Now, the newspaper articles have never said exactly where in the yard she was found. I would imagine she was probably in the side or the backyard. Otherwise, somebody driving by would obviously have seen her body and stopped to help. So when her body was found, not only has she been laying out there, they approximate for about 12 hours, but of course it's cold out in Illinois in December. So frostbite was starting to set into her hands and her feet, and they would later find out that she had been beaten with They suspect a railroad tie. There was an 18-inch railroad tie near her body. They've never definitively said that that is the murder weapon, but authorities strongly believe that that's probably what was used to hit Carol over the head. So when her body was found, she was rushed to St. Francis Hospital in Peoria, Illinois. It's about 45 minutes north of Normal. Unfortunately, Carol would succumb to her injuries, and she died the next day around 4:40 p.m. on December 24th, Christmas Eve. In an article from the Panagraph, which is dated April 2nd, 1976, they did say that she was hit on the head, they feel approximately 3 times with a board of some sort, which cracked her skull and it disrupted the blood flow to her brain. So essentially she had brain swell going on. Now this is where there's a little bit of indecisiveness. Some articles that are more recently written about Carol say that she was not robbed and she was not sexually assaulted. This article from the Panagraph in 1976 actually says they're not 100% sure whether or not she was sexually assaulted. And the reason being is because they didn't conduct what would have been a rape kit back then on her. The surgeon at the time said we were too busy trying to save her life. And then post-mortem, they said it wouldn't have been effective to conduct a rape kit. So they don't think she was sexually assaulted, but they don't definitively know whether she was or not. This is going to come into play a little bit later when some new information comes to light about other attacks that had happened on campus around the same time as Carol's murder. We do know that she wasn't robbed. Her purse was found laying beside her, and her money was still in her purse, what little money she had at the time. So nothing was taken from her. Authorities were puzzled and frustrated because there wasn't a known motive for the attack. After Carol's murder, 3 co-eds came forward to say that they had been sexually assaulted on campus in the weeks prior to Carol's murder, and they were too scared to come forward. But once news of Carol's death broke, they wondered if possibly it was the same person who had attacked them. So they did come forward to authorities with that information, although that didn't really lead anywhere. So we don't even know to this day if was that the same person that had attacked these other women. Luckily, there was a witness that came forward, an eyewitness, who at the time that he was passing by in front of Carol's sorority house when she was being attacked, they didn't realize that that's what was happening. They didn't know she was being beaten. They said that they reported that they saw Carol leaning forward and her arms were kind of hanging down by her side, and there were 2 men with her, but they thought it was just college kids goofing around. And then, of course, after news of Carol's murder came out, they realized, oh my gosh, I saw that. I just didn't know what I was seeing. So they were able to get a good enough look at one of the suspects, and they were able to make a police sketch. So I will put up a picture of that police sketch and what that suspect was described as looking like. So they did say it was a white male. He was around 6'2", weighed about 200 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes, and the age range was anywhere from 18 to 25. You can see in the police sketch that he had a full beard and a mustache. He was wearing a stocking cap and a winter coat with kind of a prominent collar. The other man that was with him, they didn't get a good enough look at to be able to do a police sketch, but they described him as being a white male, about 5'4", so much shorter than the other suspect. He weighed about 180 pounds. He had white hair, green eyes, and they put him in the age range of 25 to 35 years old. It's also important to note that the suspect that they made the sketch of, they said he was holding what they thought was a club. So that very well could have been the railroad tie that they saw in his hand. Now, of course, I'm kind of sketchy on eyewitness testimony. Especially if you're going by something and you don't think anything of it, you think it's just innocent college kids goofing around. How much attention did you really pay to what these people looked like? It also would have been dark. It was around 10 to 10:15 at night that they saw them. So we think that the attack on Carol happened between 10 and 10:15 p.m. on the night of December 22nd. And then unfortunately, she laid out there. I'm also assuming too, they saw them in the front of the sorority house. I'm assuming that they probably would have moved Carol's body around to the side or the back of the sorority house once she had been beaten. I think authorities were initially excited that they had the sketch. They circulated the sketch. It did result in a lot of leads, but unfortunately those leads went nowhere. It is a really general description, and if you think about it, you know, if you have a sketch circulating of you and you have a beard and a mustache, you can easily shave off your beard and your mustache. You can get a different hat. You can get a different coat. I mean, there's ways that you can change your appearance, and it is a rather generic description. So of course, you know, it's a college campus. There's a lot of men in that age range that would be walking around. So unfortunately, that sketch really didn't lead anywhere. One thing about this case that I think is a little odd is that a year and a half before Carol was murdered, she was actually attacked in her same sorority house. On July 16th, 1974, around 3 a.m., someone had cut the phone lines to the sorority house and broke into the house by climbing the fire escape. They went into Carol's bedroom, and when she awoke, a man was standing over her with his hands around her neck. She screamed. He picked her out of bed and threw her against a dresser with enough force that she hit her face and her nose broke. After that, the man ran off. Of course, the authorities were called, but because it was dark and it happened so quickly, she wasn't able to give a description of this person. I think that's pretty wild that somebody that young would have 2 attacks on their life in such a short period of time. So I know police at the time were wondering, is there a connection? Is the person that broke into her bedroom a year and a half earlier the same person that ultimately ended her life? I don't know. I mean, it's just such a weird thing to have happened to this girl. I don't know. I don't know what to make of it. It's very strange that that happened to her. In 1977, there was a little bit of a break in the case, but it ended up not amounting to much. So police charged a man who had a history of mental illness because he confessed to the crime. He later recanted his confession and all the charges against him were dropped. So I don't think that this is a case of this was the suspect by any means or this was the killer. I think it was a mentally ill man looking for attention. So that really didn't amount to anything. So there wouldn't really be any leads or much public attention on this case until 2001. The Normal police detective at the time, his name is Lieutenant Rick Bleckner, he said that the department sent clothing and other evidence to the FBI to be analyzed. The FBI found fingerprints on an item of Rofstad's that was a personal belonging. They have never said specifically what this personal belonging is. I'm imagining it's probably something she had on her or was in her purse. It had never been analyzed before for fingerprints because I guess police just didn't really consider it a significant piece of evidence, but they decided, you know what, we got nothing else to go on, we might as well try and get this analyzed. Unfortunately, the fingerprints did not match anyone in the FBI's database, nor the 2 initial suspects the police had in mind. So those really didn't go anywhere. And then in 2008, so 7 years later, again, there's some renewed interest in this case because a former Chicago homicide detective, who also was the director of the Morton College Institute for Cold Case Solutions up in Cicero, Illinois, that's by Chicago, he began investigating this case. Now, his name was George Siebel, and he said at the time, quote, "I think this case is eminently solvable." So he and his student staff members started digging into Carol's case, and they conducted more than 250 interviews, which that's a lot of interviews. And he gave about 50 pages of documents over to the Normal Police Department of their findings. Siebel had said, quote, "We have a suspect, they have a couple suspects, and hopefully we can find a couple of crumbs to send to the police." George Siebel said throughout their investigations and their interviews with different people, he said, quote, "In talking with people who knew Carol, one name repeatedly came up. He described the man whose name kept coming up as, quote, having a rich history of violence towards females and a man who made believable threats to at least 8 people's lives." So that's significant. So it does sound like authorities have had a suspect in mind, and this again might be a case of we know who did it or we strongly suspect who did it. We just don't have that one piece of evidence to be able to make an arrest, which is so frustrating. So that was in 2008. Obviously, they gave their findings to the Normal PD. Again, nothing really happened with that. Then there was a little bit of renewed interest again in 2017. So a senior at Illinois State University, he was a sociology major. His name is James Doughty. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He actually decided to take on this case as part of a class assignment. So he was going through cold cases in Illinois and thought this sounded interesting because obviously it happened at Illinois State and it was still unsolved after all these years. So he started to dig in and started to investigate it. And he said even after his assignment was complete, he just couldn't let it go. So he started to talk to more people and he's like, I didn't know what I was doing, but I kept at it. And through gathering information on his own and calling various sources, Doughty was put in contact with somebody who had known Carol Rofstad back in the day. He said that, quote, I contacted them, and needless to say, the conversation was odd. Doughty said that the conversation that he had with this individual made him feel very uncomfortable. And basically, you know, he took his findings to the police and decided to step back and let the authorities handle things. He did say that one day he might release a podcast of all of his findings, which I hope he does because I think it would be really interesting to listen to. So that brings us to today. It's December 2020. It's been 45 years since Carol Rofstad's murder. If she was alive, she would be 66 years old today. And I can't help but think, what kind of a life would she have led? You know, what would her career have been? Would she have gotten married, had kids? If she did, they'd probably be around my age. She might even have grandchildren by now. So it's really sad to think that her life was cut short in a senseless act of violence for absolutely no reason. Today, the Delta Zeta sorority house no longer stands at 602 South Fell Avenue. It's actually apartment complexes now. Delta Zeta is still on campus, but they are now located on Willow Street in Normal. Definitely a lot has changed on the ISU campus and even the town of Normal since the 70s. But one thing definitely hasn't changed, and that's that Carol's murderer has never been caught. Anyone with information about this case can call the Normal Police Department. They're 309-454-9526, or you can make an anonymous phone call to the Crime Stoppers of McLean County. I will put that number up as well. It is area code 309-828-1111. I'm very interested to hear what your thoughts are on this case, or anybody who does remember this case. If you lived in Normal back then, if you were a college student at the time, there's people, if you read Reddit threads about Carol Rofstad, there are comments from those who went to school with Carol. They remember this happening, or even one lady said, I happened to run into somebody in Arizona who had been Carol's roommate. Crazy. So there's a lot of people that are still affected by this. Do you think that Carol knew her attacker, or was this a random act of violence? Were the two attacks on Carol connected, or were those just coincidences? Is the attack that happened to her in the summer, the previous year and a half before, was that a standalone incident, and then her being bludgeoned to death was something completely different? We also don't know what exactly happened, obviously, when her and her friend parted ways that night and Carol continued home by herself. Was she being followed by these men? Were they waiting at the sorority house for her? Or was it just a random act of violence, wrong place, wrong time type of situation? Again, love to hear your thoughts on that. I really hope that Carol Rofstad's killer will be brought to justice. I think with the advances in DNA technology and forensics, that it is definitely a possibility. It's scary to think that this person is out there. And also remember, he had an accomplice. Somebody else was with him. So if these two men are still out there, somebody absolutely knows who did this. And I hope that they contact authorities, and I hope that we're able to get an arrest made for Carol Rofstad's murder. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.